Chapter 25 of The Paradise Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chuck Spawn, Sherwood, Wisconsin, January 30th, 2007. The Paradise Mystery by J. S. Fletcher. Chapter 25. The Old Well House. When Bryce came hurrying up to him, Folliot was standing at his garden door with his hands thrust under his coat-tails, the very picture of a benevolent, leisured gentleman who has nothing to do and is disposed to give his time to anybody. He glanced at Bryce as he had glanced at Glassdale, over the tops of his spectacles, and the glance had no more than a mild inquiry in it. But if Bryce had been less excited, he would have swept a sharp look over the clothes and ascertained that there was no one about, that Bryce's entrance was unobserved, save for a child or two playing under the tall elms near one of the gates, and for a clerical figure that stalked a path in the far distance. The close was empty of life, and there was no one about either in that part of Folliot's big garden. "I want a bit of talk with you," said Bryce, as Folliot closed the door and turned down a side path to a still more retired region. "Private talk. Let's go where it's quiet." Without replying in words to this suggestion, Folliot led the way through his rose trees to a far corner of his grounds, where an old building of grey stone, covered with ivy, stood amongst the high trees. He turned the key of a doorway and motioned Bryce to enter. "Quiet enough in here, Doctor," he observed. "You've never seen this place. Bit of a fancy of mine." Bryce, absorbed as he was in the thoughts of the moment, glanced curiously at the place into which Folliot had led him. It was a square building of old stone, its walls unlined, unplastered, its floor paved with much worn flags of limestone, evidently set down in a long dead age and now polished to marble-like smoothness. In its midst, set flush with the floor, was what was evidently a trap-door, furnished with a heavy iron ring. To this Folliot pointed, with a glance of significant interest. "Deepest well in all Wrychester under that," he remarked. "You'd never think it. It's 100 feet deep, and more. Dry now. Water gave out some years ago. Some people would have pulled this old well house down, but not me. I did better. I turned it to good account." He raised a hand and pointed upward to an obviously modern ceiling of strong oak timbers. "Had that put in," he continued, "and turned the top of the building into a little snuggery. Come up." He led the way to a flight of steps in one corner of the lower room, pushed open a door at their head, and showed his companion into a small apartment arranged and furnished in something closely approaching to luxury. The walls were hung with thick fabrics. The carpeting was equally thick. There were pictures, books, and curiosities. The 2 or 3 chairs were deep and big enough to lie down in. The 2 windows commanded pleasant views of the cathedral towers on one side and of the close on the other. "Nice little place to be alone in, do you see?" said Folliot. "Cool in summer, warm in winter. Modern fire grate, you notice. Come here when I want to do a little bit of quiet thinking, what?" "Good place for that, certainly," agreed Bryce. Folliot pointed his visitor to one of the big chairs, and turning to a cabinet, brought out some glasses, a siphon of soda water, and a heavy cut-glass decanter. He nodded at a box of cigars which lay open on a table at Bryce's elbow as he began to mix a couple of drinks. "Help yourself," he said. "Good stuff, those." Not until he had given Bryce a drink, and had carried his own glass to another easy-chair, did Folliot refer to any reason for Bryce's visit. But once settled down, he looked at him speculatively. "What did you want to see me about?" he asked. Bryce, who had lighted a cigar, looked across its smoke at the imperturbable face opposite. "You've just had Glassdale here," he observed quietly. "I saw him leave you." Folliot nodded without any change of expression. "Aye, Doctor," he said. "And what do you know about Glassdale now?" Bryce, who would have cheerfully hobnobbed with a man whom he was about to conduct to the scaffold, lifted his glass and drank. "A good deal," he answered, as he set his glass down. "The fact is, I came here to tell you so. I know a good deal about everything." "A wide term," remarked Folliot. "You've got some limitations to it, I should think. What do you mean by everything?" "I mean about recent matters," replied Bryce. "I've interested myself in them for reasons of my own. Ever since Braden was found at the foot of those stairs in Paradise, and I was fetched to him, I've been interested myself. And I've discovered a great deal more, much more than's known to anybody." Folliot threw one leg over the other and began to jog his foot. "Oh," he said after a pause. "Dear me! And what might you know now, Doctor? Aught you can tell me, eh?" "Lots," answered Bryce. "I came to tell you on seeing that Glassdale had been with you, because I was with Glassdale this morning." Folliot made no answer, but Bryce saw that his cool, almost indifferent manner was changing. He was beginning, under the surface, to get anxious. "When I left Glassdale at noon," continued Bryce, "I'd no idea, and I don't think he had, that he was coming to see you. But I know what put the notion into his head. I gave him copies of those 2 reward bills. He no doubt thought he might make a bit, and so he came into town, and to you." "Well?" asked Folliot. "I shouldn't wonder," remarked Bryce, reflectively, and almost as if speaking to himself. "I shouldn't at all wonder if Glassdale's the sort of man who can be bought. He no doubt has his price. But all that Glassdale knows is nothing to what I know." Folliot had allowed his cigar to go out. He threw it away, took a fresh one from the box, and slowly struck a match and lighted it. "What might you know now?" he asked after another pause. "I've a bit of faculty for finding things out," answered Bryce boldly, "and I've developed it. I want to know all about Braden, and about who killed him and why. There's only one way of doing all that sort of thing, you know. You've got to go back, a long way back, to the very beginnings. I went back to the time when Braden was married. Not as Braden, of course, but as who he really was, John Brake. That was at a place called Braden Medworth, near Barthorpe, in Leicestershire." He paused there, watching Folliot, but Folliot showed no more than close attention, and Bryce went on. "Not much in that for the really important part of the story," he continued. "But Brake had other associations with Barthorpe. A bit later, he got into close touch with a Barthorpe man who, about the time of Brake's marriage, left Barthorpe and settled in London. Brake and this man began to have some secret dealings together. There was another man in with him, too, a man who was a sort of partner with the Barthorpe man. Brake had evidently a belief in these men, and he trusted them. Unfortunately for himself, he sometimes trusted the bank's money to them. I know what happened. He used to let them have money for short financial transactions to be refunded within a very brief space. But he went to the fire too often and got his fingers burned in the end. The 2 men did him, one of them in particular, and cleared out. He had to stand the racket. He stood it to the tune of 10 years penal servitude, and naturally when he'd finished his time, he wanted to find those 2 men and began a long search for them. Like to know the names of the men, Mr. Folliot?" "You might mention 'em if you know 'em," answered Folliot. "The name of the particular one was Ray, Faulkner Ray," replied Bryce promptly. "Of the other, the man of lesser importance, Flood." The 2 men looked quietly at each other for a full moment's silence, and it was Bryce who first spoke with a ring of confidence in his tone that showed that he knew he had the whip hand. "Shall I tell you something about Faulkner Ray?" he asked. "I will. It's deeply interesting. Mr. Faulkner Ray, after cheating and deceiving Brake, and leaving him to pay the penalty of his over-trustfulness, cleared out of England and carried his money-making talent.